The turning of a thief's heart. In a small, humble village nestled between rolling green hills and winding rivers, there lived a notorious thief named Raoul. His name struck fear in the hearts of the townspeople, for he had been known to steal from merchants, farmers, and even the church. Raoul was swift and clever, always staying one step ahead of the village guards. His exploits were whispered in hushed tones, but there was one person in the village who looked up to him with pride, his young son, Lucien. Lucien, only 14 years old, idolized his father. Raoul had raised him alone after his wife had passed away when Lucien was just a boy. As a result, Lucien had been his father's shadow, following him through the nights, learning the art of stealth and the skills necessary to pick locks and slip into homes unnoticed. To Lucien, his father wasn't a thief, he was a hero, a man who outsmarted the world. But deep down, Lucien felt uneasy. Whenever they returned home with their spoils, something gnawed at his heart. It wasn't the thrill of the act that lingered, it was the guilt. Watching the villagers struggle after Raoul's thefts, seeing families lose their hard-earned money, and the way fear clouded their faces, it began to weigh heavily on Lucien. He had always wanted to make his father proud, but he started to wonder if there was another way. One evening, as the sun set over the village, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange, Raoul approached Lucien with a gleam in his eye. "Tonight's the big one, son," he said, rubbing his hands together excitedly. The post office. Lucien's heart sank. The post office was where the villagers stored their savings, kept under lock and key by the postmaster, a kind but stern man who had always been fair to everyone. Lucien thought of the treasure, money the villagers had put away for future needs, for emergencies, or to send their children to school. Stealing from the post office wouldn't just be a theft, it would devastate the entire village. "But why, father?" Lucien asked, trying to mask his apprehension. "The post office? They don't have much there." Raoul grinned. "Exactly. No one would expect anyone to steal from there, and it's not just about the money, it's the biggest challenge I've faced yet. Imagine the thrill, Lucien. The glory of pulling it off." Lucien hesitated, his mind racing. He wanted to impress his father, to be the loyal son Raoul expected him to be. But as he thought of the consequences for the village, something stirred within him. He didn't want to be responsible for their suffering. That night, as the two slipped through the shadows toward the post office, Lucien made a decision. He would follow his father, but he had to find a way to stop him without causing a confrontation. His father's love for him was unquestionable, but Raoul's pride in his skill and reputation was fierce. Lucien needed to be careful. As they approached the post office, Raoul knelt by the door, his fingers deftly working to pick the lock. "Watch closely, Lucien," he whispered. "You'll need to master this technique one day." Lucien pretended to observe, his thoughts whirling. His father had always been patient with him, teaching him everything about their craft, but tonight, Lucien wasn't focused on learning. He was thinking about how to stop Raoul without raising suspicion. Once inside, the building was eerily quiet. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floors. The safe that held the village's treasure was in the back, behind the postmaster's desk. Raoul moved silently, his every step measured. Lucien followed, his heart pounding in his chest. As Raoul began to work on the safe, Lucien's mind raced. He had to do something. He couldn't let this happen. He looked around the room, searching for a distraction, something to buy time. His eyes fell on the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. "Father," Lucien whispered, "wait." Raoul looked up, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" Lucien hesitated, then spoke, his voice trembling slightly. I think someone's coming." Raoul's eyes darted toward the door, his muscles tensing. He listened for a moment, then shook his head. "No one's coming, Lucien. We're safe. Now, let me concentrate." Lucien's heart sank. His father was too focused to be distracted. He needed to think of something else, something that would make Raoul reconsider. And then, an idea struck him. "Father," Lucien whispered again, "what if we don't need to do this? Raoul paused, his hand hovering over the lock. He turned to look at his son, confusion flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? Lucien swallowed hard. I mean, what if there's another way? We don't have to steal. We could find work. We could earn money, like the villagers do. Raoul stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Work? Raoul repeated, his voice low. You want us to work like common laborers? Lucien nodded, his heart racing. Yes, I know it's not what we're used to, but maybe it's time for a change. Maybe we don't need to live like this anymore. Raoul's face darkened. You're my son, he said, his voice growing cold. You're supposed to follow in my footsteps. This is who we are, Lucien. This is what we do. But is it really who we are? Lucien asked, his voice steadying. Or is it just what we've been doing because we don't know anything else? Raoul glared at him, but Lucien could see the uncertainty in his eyes. His father wasn't an evil man. He had simply fallen into a life of crime because he didn't know any other way. But now, Lucien was offering him a way out, a chance to change. We don't have to be thieves, Lucien continued, his voice soft but firm. We can start over. We can work hard, earn our money honestly, and be part of the village again. Isn't that what you want? A better life for us? Raoul's gaze faltered. For the first time, Lucien saw something in his father's eyes that he had never seen before, doubt. Raoul looked down at the safe, then back at Lucien. His hands trembled slightly. Lucien, Raoul began, but his voice trailed off. He looked away, his jaw clenched. Lucien stepped forward, placing a hand on his father's arm. Father, I love you, he said quietly. And I know you love me. But we can't keep living like this. It's not right. We're hurting people. We're hurting ourselves. Raoul closed his eyes, his face contorted with emotion. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he stepped back from the safe. I don't know how to stop, Lucien, he whispered, his voice barely audible. This is all I've ever known. Lucien smiled gently. We'll figure it out together. We'll learn. We'll work hard, and we'll make an honest living. It won't be easy, but it'll be worth it. Raoul opened his eyes and looked at his son. For the first time in years, he saw not a boy following in his footsteps, but a young man standing on his own, guiding him toward a different path. A path he had never considered before. Without another word, Raoul turned away from the safe and headed for the door. Lucien followed, relief flooding through him. They slipped out of the post office and back into the night, but this time, they weren't running from something, they were leaving it behind. Over the next few weeks, Raoul and Lucien began a new chapter of their lives. It wasn't easy. Finding work in the village was a challenge, especially given Raoul's reputation. But Lucien was determined, and eventually, they found small jobs here and there, helping farmers, repairing tools, and doing whatever honest work they could find. At first, the villagers were wary of them, but over time, they began to see the change in Raoul. He wasn't the same man who had once terrorized their village. He was a man trying to make amends, trying to build a better life for his son. Lucien, too, grew stronger and more confident. He no longer felt the weight of guilt on his shoulders. Instead, he felt pride in the hard work they were doing, pride in the life they were building together. As the months passed, Raoul and Lucien became a part of the village again. They were no longer outsiders, no longer feared. They were respected for their efforts, for the honesty with which they lived their lives. One evening, as they sat together outside their small home, watching the sun set over the hills, Raoul turned to Lucien and smiled. You were right, son, he said quietly. There's more to life than the thrill of the steal. Lucien smiled back, his heart full of warmth. There's a lot more, father.